In 1520 BC, a team of men broke into the pyramid of a long-dead pharaoh, stripped the burial chamber clean, and walked away with everything. The gold. The jewels. The sacred oils. They left the mummy desecrated on the floor. Nobody stopped them. And that moment, quiet, criminal, almost invisible in the historical record, may have been the beginning of the end of the greatest architectural tradition in human history. Here's the question that most textbooks skip: Egypt built pyramids for roughly 1,000 years. Then they stopped. Completely. No gradual decline, no half-finished monuments. The tradition just ended. And the civilization didn't collapse with it. Egypt kept going for another 15 centuries. So why stop? The answer isn't simple. It involves economics, religion, catastrophic failure, and one of the most radical pharaohs who ever lived. Every thread connects. And by the end, you'll see why the pyramid's death was actually the sign of something darker. Let's start at the beginning, because context matters here. The first true pyramid was built around 2650 BC for the pharaoh Djoser at Saqqara. It was a step pyramid, 6 massive terraces stacked on top of each other, designed by a man named Imhotep, who was so brilliant that later generations would literally worship him as a god. That structure was a revolution. Before it, Egyptian royalty was buried in flat-topped mud brick structures called mastabas. Imhotep essentially stacked 6 mastabas on top of each other and changed the world. Within 2 generations, Egyptian architects had refined the design into the true pyramid shape. By 2560 BC, Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza was standing. 480 feet tall. 2.5 million stone blocks. It remained the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. So the Egyptians clearly knew what they were doing. This wasn't an accident. This was a civilization at the absolute peak of its organizational and architectural capacity. Then something started going wrong. The first crack appeared not in the stones, but in the economics. The pyramid building era of the Old Kingdom was funded by a highly centralized state. The pharaoh controlled everything: the grain, the labor, the resources. Building a pyramid wasn't just a religious act, it was a political statement. It said, I am the axis of this civilization. All roads lead to me. But by 2150 BC, that centralized power had fractured. Regional governors, called nomarchs, had accumulated enough independent wealth and influence to challenge royal authority. Egypt fell into a period historians call the First Intermediate Period. Civil war. Famine. Fragmentation. Pyramid building didn't stop entirely during this time, but the pyramids that were built were smaller. Cheaper. Some were built from mud brick with a thin limestone veneer, looking impressive from the outside, hollow and fragile underneath. Several have literally collapsed into sand dunes. The ambition was still there, but the resources weren't. When Egypt reunified under the Middle Kingdom pharaohs around 2055 BC, pyramid building resumed, but it never fully recovered its Old Kingdom grandeur. These were competent structures, not transcendent ones. And then came the problem that no engineer could solve. The pyramids were being robbed. Systematically. Relentlessly. This is the part the history books treat as a footnote, but it's actually central to everything. A pyramid is, by design, visible from miles away. It announces, a very rich dead person is inside here. It was practically an invitation. Egyptian burial practice required that the pharaoh's body remain intact for the afterlife. The soul, the ka, are needed to return to the physical form. Desecration wasn't just theft. It was the destruction of immortality. The robbers knew this. And they did it anyway. By the Second Intermediate Period around 1650 BC, it was clear that no matter how many traps, false chambers, or granite plugs the architects installed, determined thieves would eventually find a way in. The pyramids had become monuments to vulnerability rather than eternal power. Egypt's rulers were placing their most sacred possessions, including their own future existence, inside structures that were essentially giant targets. Something had to change. Enter Thutmose I. Around 1504 BC, this pharaoh made a decision so quiet that no official proclamation survives to record it. He chose not to build a pyramid. Instead, he ordered his tomb cut deep into a remote limestone cliff on the west bank of the Nile, in a hidden desert valley. We now call it the Valley of the Kings. His architect, a man named Enini, left behind an inscription that tells us exactly what the thinking was. He wrote that he oversaw the excavation of the royal tomb alone, no one seeing, no one hearing. Secrecy, not spectacle, was now the strategy. This was a seismic shift. For over 1,000 years, Egyptian royal burial had been defined by visibility. The pyramid said, "Look at me, I am powerful, I am eternal." The hidden tomb said something completely different, "You'll never find me." It worked, at least for a while. Some Valley of the Kings tombs remained undisturbed for over 3,000 years. Tutankhamun's tomb, famously discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, was still substantially intact when he broke through the sealed door. But Thutmose I's decision wasn't just strategic. It reflected a deeper shift in Egyptian religious thinking. The pyramid had a specific theological purpose. Its shape pointed to the sky. Its internal passages aligned with stars. It was, quite literally, a machine designed to project the dead pharaoh's soul into the heavens, specifically toward Orion's belt, which the Egyptians associated with Osiris, god of the dead. But Egyptian religion was not static. Over those 1,000 years of pyramid building, theology evolved. By the New Kingdom, the emphasis had shifted from the dramatic skyward launch of the royal soul to a more intimate journey through the underworld, a series of tests, judgments, and trials described in the Book of the Dead. That journey didn't require a pyramid. It required the right spells, the right rituals, the right sacred objects placed carefully in a hidden chamber. The pyramid had been the vehicle. Now the vehicle was obsolete, replaced by something invisible and internal. The architecture of the afterlife went underground. And then came Akhenaten. In 1353 BC, this strange and polarizing pharaoh attempted to dismantle the entire Egyptian religious establishment and replace it with monotheistic worship of the sun disk, the Aten. He moved the capital, disbanded the priesthood, and erased the names of traditional gods from monuments across Egypt. He did not build a pyramid. His successors, scrambling to restore order and erase his memory, did not build pyramids either. By the time Egypt's political and religious establishment restabilized, the pyramid tradition had been broken for so long that revival was unthinkable. It belonged to a different Egypt, an older, stranger, more mythological Egypt that the New Kingdom rulers were actively trying to move beyond. So why did the Egyptians stop building pyramids? Because the pyramids failed. They failed as security systems. They failed as theological instruments. And they became politically inconvenient for rulers who needed flexibility, secrecy, and a religious framework that had grown beyond them. The pyramids weren't abandoned because Egypt declined. They were abandoned because Egypt changed. The civilization had outgrown its most iconic creation and recognized, with brutal pragmatism, that eternal life required a better hiding place than a mountain of stone pointing at the sky. The last pyramid built for an Egyptian pharaoh was completed around 1550 BC. After that, silence. If you want to understand what happened inside those hidden tombs they built instead, what the Egyptians believed waited for them in the dark, that's the next episode.